I'm going to introduce our esteemed panel of speakers in a minute. They'll have about 5 to 7 minutes each to give their introductory thoughts on the topic. I'm going to be keeping you to time. And then we'll have a brief discussion here on the panel before I then bring you in, as I said. So, the topic for this second debate, we heard a lot about the rise of populist and right-wing parties in Europe, the state of democracy, and technocrats among the political class. But in this discussion, we're going to move on to talk a bit more about the politics of nationalism and identity. What do those look like today compared to the past? How did nationalism become a sort of dirty word, and can it have any can it bring anything positive with it? And how come identity politics is all the rage today? What identities are valued and which ones are looked down upon? So with us to talk about these issues and no doubt many more, we have 3 speakers, Kesar Mahmoud, Lars Trekod and Frank Furedi. So could we give a big round of applause and welcome to our speakers. And just introductions before I let them speak. Kesar Mahmoud is the Heritage Manager of Sweden's National Heritage Board. He's also the author of the book Jakten på svenskheten, or The Hunt for Swedishness, I suppose. Oops, I'm breaking the equipment.
Or The Quest for Swedishness.
The Quest for Swedishness.
It sounds more
sophisticated.
Yes.
Great. So for that book, he traveled around Sweden on his motorcycle in search of a Swedish national identity. And the book sparked many debates about Swedishness and belonging here in Sweden. Kesar writes prolifically as well for the media, Swedish media, so I'm sure you've read and seen him around. Our second speaker for the evening will be Lars Trekod, who is a professor of history at Ersta Sköndal University College here in Stockholm, but his research has largely been conducted in the United States, and it revolves around the welfare state and civil society, roughly. Lars is also the author, I'd like to mention, of a book about Swedishness called Är svensken människa, or Are Swedes human, or is the Swede a human? And I'd like to give it a plug because I really enjoyed reading this book, and I think it is essential reading for anyone who wants to get to grips with Swedish identity, mentality, history, and culture. So do go and get a copy. And our final speaker will be Frank Furedi, who has flown in from England. Frank is originally from Hungary, though, and he's a prolific writer with books covering everything from terrorism and risk to parenting and trust. Frank also often appears in the media in the UK and beyond, and right now he is a visiting professor at UCL in London and an associate professor at the University of Kent. He's also a regular speaker at the Battle of Ideas Festival in London. So welcome to all our speakers again. And Kesar,
do you want me to start? Okay. Although Swedes exaggerate their fluentness in English, I would like to confess that my English isn't that good. So I've actually written my 5 minutes that I'm going to start with. One of my favorite TV shows is a series called Sons of Anarchy. It's about a biker motorcycle gang, an outlaw one. And what fascinates me with this TV series is that even a criminal biker gang with an ambition to live outside the society cannot escape the creation of making rules. And about who's actually part of this gang or not. And they have really clear rules about who is allowed to be a member of this biker gang. And there are 2 ways to actually gain a membership in this biker gang, Sam Crow. And the one is to have a father who has been part of who is a member since before, and the other one is to actually be a prospect And if you show your loyalty to this MC biker gang, then you are allowed to be a fully member. And since I've been actually possessed by the idea of understanding national identities and the need for them, I think I find it very amusing to see actually that there are connections, similarities between how you gain membership in this outlaw biker gang and national citizenship. Because both of these memberships, they are based on same ideas. One is that you have to have some sort of blood-wise ties to someone who has been a former member, or you can be seen as a prospect. And if you carry out your duties and you show that you are loyal, then you can be granted a membership. And I think that one adequate question that maybe I think we're going to discuss here is it important in our global time to feel national identities or to sense that you are part of them? I mean, can't we just all be human? Isn't that enough? I would say that I would answer no to that question, because I think that even if you are a member of a football team or a workplace or any sort of community, the sense of belonging and being a part of that is really important. And because if you take, for example, Swedishness, today Swedishness is more about how you look, rather than you being a part of this, the society. So I think it's an important democratic question about how we can recharge the national Swedish identity.
Okay.
I think I stopped.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you so much. And Lars, your thoughts, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, let me continue in a way. I think that your comments, I very much will attach myself to them. I think you're absolutely right, and I think this is a good sort of starting point, because I think there is today in Sweden, but not just here, a kind of cluelessness about the importance of the nation. I think it has become fashionable in a way to think of the nation as something kind of bad, maybe racist, something that bad people do, or something that we did in the past, but that we now live in some sort of post-national order. We are cosmopolitans, we're global citizens. And this comes in both in a sort of a center-right and center-left version, right? And we see this very clearly in Sweden, where on the left, you have a lot of people who think in some sense that we have sort of reached another stage. We're post-national, we're concerned with human rights issues more than we are concerned with citizenship, for example. And on the left, center-right in Sweden, we've had the last 8 years a government that has been, I think, living in another kind of a fantasy, namely that we live in a global market society, right? Which is another form, really, of thinking about, but we are in a post-national state. And I think that it is, from my point of view, this kind of naivete, and I would say mistaken analysis, has also created a vacuum that has been filled recently by the Sweden Democrats. And I think that the debate in Sweden have tended to be preoccupied with, in a way, condemning, the Sweden Democrats rather than speaking about who we are, right? What is the current we? And here, I think, what is so astounding is that if we go back to when we had a real crisis in Europe in the 1930s, in Sweden, for example, we had the Depression. There was a lot more unemployment than we can even begin to imagine today. During this time, we also had fascist parties that were still untainted by the Holocaust. Right? How many people voted then in Sweden for a National Socialist or Fascist Party? was never above 1%, right? Now that tells you something, right, about Sweden at that time. And I think what was going on there, which we need to return to, is that there was a vibrant, what we can think of, left-wing nationalism in Sweden. A clear national narrative about Sweden as being the home of freedom, of democracy, the people's home concept, which effectively, right, could compete successfully against a kind of a Nazi version of Volksgemeinschaft, let's say. It had everything to do with a kind of historical understanding what Sweden was, a valuing of the democratic institutions. That meant that nationalism, the national narrative, right, became the property of the democratic left, right, in Sweden. It was, if you will, a kind of vaccination, right, against racist right-wing versions of nationalism. Today, we do not have this anymore, right? We're having both, so to speak, a left and a right that live in a kind of a post-national fantasy land. And I think they need to return to the questions that you're raising, right? Which is, you know, we were not in the 1930s, contrary to what some people argue today, thought of as being defined by the way we look. The definitions then were about, indeed, values, what we can think of a form of civic nationalism, right? Finally, my final point is that this is so important, right? Because historically, we know that we cannot even begin to imagine really a democracy without a firm foundation in some notion of national community. And we certainly cannot think about a politics of solidarity in the form of a welfare state with some idea of national community and belonging. That is not a choice that we have. The choice we have is how do we erect that we, right? So as not to delve into a kind of exclusionary process in terms of, let's say, racial, ethnic, religious belonging. Right? That's the question.
Thank you. Frank.
Yeah, thanks very much. I would like to kind of continue where the last two speakers went off. One of the things that strikes me traveling around Europe is that no matter what the culture, no matter what the religion, what the political complexion of a community is, the question of belonging is the one that haunts Europe everywhere. And what I find really striking is that the language that we use in the 21st century often sounds very, very hollow. I think nationalism is a very good example of that, because no matter what any of us would like to do, the really interesting thing is that nationalism is become emptied of its meaning all across the board. Nationalism no longer captures the mood of the times. It no longer motivates people. Even the so-called far-right nationalist parties have become caricatures of nationalism. Myself, I'm Hungarian originally. I've done interviews with the right-wing Jobbik movement who are meant to be nationalists, but their nationalism is almost like a kind of a cartoon, Walt Disney cartoon imitation, which has got no real substance or content to it. In Britain, where I live, we have a constant demand for what is British. You know, the government says we need British values to be taught in schools. And the moment you ask, well, what are those British values, you get this embarrassed silence. You know, I go to Holland and, you know, big debates, what does it mean to be Dutch? And you scratch the surface, you know, and there's, again, an embarrassed look of, people look at their shoelaces and they're not really sure. I mean, the poor Dutch were so confused about what it means to be Dutch that they ended up showing films of naked people, you know, sort of, and showing how liberal we are. That's what Dutch is really all about. There's a way of trying to fabricate something that gives a definition to Holland. And I think you find that all over the place, that there really isn't. I think with the possible exception of Russia, where there's something happening, which is quite interesting, what we're living through is a time where the sense of belonging and the aspiration for belonging lacks a narrative that captures the imagination. And I think that one of the consequences of that is that instead of nationalism and nationalist narrative, we are increasingly living in a very segmented society where people kind of fall back upon identities which are themselves very fragmented and very fragile, which do not really give people the satisfaction of genuine connection, genuine solidarity, with other people. And what you, as a result, end up having is not just simply identities in terms of the classical forms of identities, but almost a kind of consumerist sort of extension of that, where it's your lifestyle that becomes increasingly the one area that you try to capture in a very kind of privatized sort of inverted self. And I think that one of the problems that exist is that in the absence of any narrative about belonging, we're left with the fact that people like myself, or people who are maybe privileged in terms of having a university education, a relatively decent middle-class job, that's not a huge problem for us, because we can always, I can always go ski in France, and I can always, go drinking in Italy, and sort of and get by like that. But for the vast majority of people who are living in communities throughout Europe, who aren't necessarily tuned into this kind of cosmopolitan networks, these so-called globalized networks that exist, life continues in the old way. There is still this sense of emptiness. There's what I call a profound sense of cultural uncertainty. Who are we? What are we really about? And I think that seems to be the big question of our time. And I think where I think we all seem to agree on one point is that this seems to be a question that tends to be almost self-consciously ignored and overlooked. And it takes on its most pathologized form in the strident attempt to deny that nationalism could possibly have any other meaning than a fascist meaning in the 21st century. There's a kind of denial of the need for people to have some kind of affiliation. And I think the question that we're kind of confronted with is how in the 21st century we create connections amongst ourselves, in real solidarity amongst ourselves, in a way that isn't a caricature, but is based organically upon our life in the communities that we live in. How we kind of politicize that, and how we ensure that we have a more civic sort of way in which questions of sovereignty, questions of solidarity can be shared and discussed, and ultimately our life kind of reshaped by it, so that we can go forward and not really kind of live in the past and try to lament what has been lost, but instead of lamenting what has been lost, we kind of look to the future and build solidarity on a new foundation.
Okay, thank you. But I want to pick up on this importance of belonging, or having a sense of belonging, that you mentioned. I think everyone's mentioned in different ways. Does that have to be tied to the concept of the nation? I mean, is the national identity and forging a national identity the only way to sort of ensure belonging? Or is that what belonging is necessarily based on? If you see what I mean.
Well, you need a community, and you need a measure of sovereignty. Now, that doesn't have to be a classical, old-fashioned national sovereignty, but you need to have a rootedness of institutions within some kind of recognizable physical space to which people can relate to. Because if it's just all global and ephemeral, it kind of goes through people's hands. It doesn't relate to people's imagination. And I think one of the things that I'm sure everybody in this room must feel, I don't think there's anybody that doesn't feel that, is that you do feel, don't you, that you feel estranged sometimes. You don't feel that there are very many things in our lives that motivate and brings us together. And in fact, I'm a football fan. And when I go watch football, it's one of the few times I feel I'm a part of something that's bigger than me, right? I mean, it's strange that I should feel that. I know, talking to my son, who's 18, he feels that way when he goes to rock concerts. That's one of the few times that he feels part of something. And it's all really shallow, segmented kind of caricatures of what we really need. But at the end of the day, whether you're Swedish or British or whatever you want to call yourself, and whatever it takes on the classical national form, there needs to be some way that we give an institutional expression, a geographical expression, to that kind of linkages.
Thanks. Kessler.
Yeah, well, I think you can feel many kind of sense of belongings, right? But as long as we have a state, and that state controls your lives by making laws and so on, then I find it difficult to see how we could function with each other or feel solidarity without having a sense of us belonging together. And because I mean, if you look at all group identities, they're just it's just a different name for having a relationship. So Swedishness is nothing more than the name of the relationship that you are engaged in with all the other citizens or with the state. I mean, both the vertical one and the horizontal one.
But I just want to get perhaps more of a concrete sense, because we're talking about pretty big and vague concepts. But how is this identity supposed to be forged? You know, is it going to come from us, the people? Is it the responsibility of politicians or the establishment? I mean, you know, sort of more concretely, how is that achieved?
But I think, but I don't think that it has to be concrete, because it's not what you put in the idea. It's the idea is more important than the actual what the idea consists about. I read an article last year about Britishness. And in the article, you interviewed four persons and asked them, "What is Britishness to you?" And the funny thing is that they answered that it was standing in a queue, enjoying freedom and sense of individuality that was important. And I think that would be the same idea of Swedishness if you would go out here in the street and ask someone about how they would define Swedishness.
Lars?
Well, I'd like to return to your point about institutions, right? I mean, I think that nationalism is connected to the nation state, right? And the nation state is a set of institutions that also provide rights, right? Hannah Arendt, in some sort of kind of critique, right, of facile human rights language, right? Points out that the key right is the right to rights, which we, obtain through citizenship, right? And that is to say, we are incorporated into a series of institutions that provide us, right, with not just belonging in a sort of fuzzy sense, right, but with very, concrete rights, powers, resources, right? We have a state that makes investments in its citizens, right? Education, healthcare, and so forth. These are real things. These are not, just sort of discourses out there. Now, how those feelings have been, the sense of belonging being created, that is a question that we historians have been asking for a long time, and there is a whole literature really on, the invention of tradition and the imagined community of the nation and so forth. And when you look at that literature, what you see is, in fact, institutions. Eugene Weber's famous book, making peasants into Frenchmen, points out that in France in mid-19th century, not even half of the population actually spoke French, right? Then by 1914, we have a situation where the kind of idea of the international, right, loses out to national belonging, right? So something happens here between even 1817, 1914, which has to do with the immense success, right, of the institutions of the nation state. And chief among those, right, then, are things we've actually touched upon that in a previous discussion here, the previous panel, were public schools, right? The draft for young men, right? And also a common media that served as a vehicle for a common understanding, a common narrative, right, about who we are. That is what historically happened. What is interesting today, and this I think goes to your point before about the sort of splintered society that we live in today, is that we have, at least in Sweden, dismantled effectively all three of these institutions. We no longer really have a unified public school system. We do not have the draft anymore, and media has become segmented, even though we still primarily trust right? Public radio, right? As you well know, right? P1, that's what most Swedes trust more than anything else. It's just interesting, right? But I had this conversation with the former prime minister when I was sitting on this commission on this future in Sweden, and he was, I think, genuinely talking about a goal for Sweden as being a society that embraced diversity, embraced immigration, right? And I think he was very genuine about that. But I asked him, I said, fine, but these are words. I said, where are the institutions that create contact, right? That provide those meetings, that sense of having a common story, a common experience. I said, because you've chosen, or your government and the previous one has chosen to give priority to other values, you know, let's say choice more important than a common experience, individual freedom more important than to have obligatory draft for young men and so forth and so on. And I said, that is fine. You can choose to do away with those institutions on those grounds because you have other priorities. But you cannot expect there to be a sense of common we, unless we have institutions that provide the context for that. And I think that is a real problem we're facing today.
But I think perhaps if we can move on to another aspect that's sort of tied to this, because when it comes to that desire for common institutions or social rights or whatever, as in rites of passage and so on that you talk about the draft and that kind of thing, is that desire even existent in the political class? You suggest it's not, but then I also feel that maybe the policy of multiculturalism comes in here, in a sense that, if we're all sort of supposed to embrace and value our difference, and that promotion comes from above and from various levels of society, then what does that mean for social cohesion? What does that mean for the ability to forge a kind of commonality and common sense of belonging? I don't know if do you want to comment on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that aside from the institutions, there are more basic communities of solidarity. In other words, between the individual and the institution of the state, there is the solidarity that in previous times was provided by religious organizations, or the labor movement in Europe was very important. I mean, in Germany, the labor movement was a state within the state, and a real millions of members and newspapers and theaters and cinemas. So there are all these other forms of institutions that kind of bind people together within a nation state. And I think what's interesting today is that even these very basic fundamental institutions of solidarity are much feebler today than they would have been in the past. And obviously it takes on a different pattern in different parts of Europe. Sweden, as it happens, from the outside looks much more together, even today, even with all the problems, than many other European societies, where many of the where in fact there's very little that goes on. When I was in Finland recently, I was really struck by the fact that I did a little lecture, and I went out with other people, and every single member of the panel and in the audience who came with us were saying that they were members of choirs. They sing together. And some of them were saying that they were singing together since they were teenagers, and then they got married, and the partners joined in, and they go on holidays with each other. There are these kind of institutions. Now, my argument is that when even these things become unravel, which is what's really happening, then we end up with a situation where there is no easy solution for fixing it. I mean, you talked about public radio. In America, England, people don't watch the same shows anymore. We have hundreds of TV channels. Black people watch different television than white people watch. So different groups watch different, sort of things. There's no longer a national conversation about a particular TV program anymore. So that, what is it that you're going to discuss at that kind of elementary level? And I think that all of these things exist on many different levels, but they're all linked together. And that ultimately has got to do with the fact that as the old narrative, the political institutions have unraveled, so too all the cultural manifestations and the cultural underpinnings have also gone. And I think that what we've done is we try to replace that with multiculturalism. We try to replace it with formulaic solutions that are diversity or different kind of institutional arrangement. I don't know in Sweden, but in Britain, every institution has got a mission statement. Have you got mission statements in Sweden? And you get the impression that the same person writes the mission statements for every organization. They all have their value statements. but they're all template, sort of values. They're all template ideals. And when we reduce to this kind of technocratic template kind of sort of philosophy, then the narratives no longer touch us. And I think that's really where we got to start. Until we get the narratives right, until we can politically and culturally come together and at the very least have a grown-up discussion, nothing else will get sorted out.
If you have something brief to say before I bring in the audience, or do you feel happy?
Bring in the audience is fine with me.
Okay.
Maybe you want to say something.
No.
No? All right. Well, we still have time. And does anyone want to ask a question, make a comment? Yeah, here.
Okay. Hello. Hey. I would just like to comment on what Law said about institutions. There are also, I think, institutions who fail at creating identities, like the EU, for example. I don't think many of us here would consider themselves Europeans. So what do you think is the reason for that?
Well, I mean,
I'd like to see. Well, just 1 second. I'm going to take a few, if there are any more at this point. Yeah, here.
I'm not really sure what my question is, but I'm going to try to phrase it live here. Now, so where do you think this kind of breakdown of the national identity comes from? Because you mentioned at some point consumerism and the idea of kind of building a lifestyle identity of some sort. And I guess if you look at Europe, generalizing a bit, but most countries in Europe probably agree. I mean, both the left and the right in Europe probably agree on the basic ideas of market liberalism these days. The left parties in Europe are still market liberal in like a broader sense. So do you think that this is this kind of like a testament to the success of market liberalism in a way, that we're now losing the sense of national identity because everyone is like an individual that's supposed to like build their own identity through consumerism or whatever? Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, great. There's one more there in the back.
I just want to know, how do you relate to the people that don't embrace the value of multiculturalism? How do you relate to them? How do you handle that? And do you force them to be included, or do you exclude them, or what will be your approach? Thank you.
I saw one more, and then I'll come back and you can pick up on the points that you want.
Hi. Yeah. This institutional perspective I thought was quite interesting. One other perspective maybe would be to look at the state and the power of the state, and maybe nationalism. I mean, I'm not an expert, so I don't know, but did nationalism sort of peak with power peaking for the state, and with the new sort of global environment that we're going into, the fact that the state doesn't have as much power anymore, isn't it logical maybe that nationalism is changing? So it's somehow this idea of a power equation, and could someone comment on that? Okay,
thank you. Les, you had a question directed at you.
Start with that, and it links a little bit up to this last question as well. As far as the EU is concerned, the EU has tried actually very hard. I mean, I used to teach a course at Columbia on nationalism, and I would have this lecture on the almost comical attempts by the EU bureaucracy, right, to create a kind of the rituals and kind of various sort of symbols of a nation, right? You know, they would bring in, Beethoven music, and they would create a flag, and there were all sorts of things, medals and whatnot, right? That we recognize from the history of nationalism. But of course, what we are left with today, right, is the crisis of the EU. This is so far a failed project. And it tells you something which I think think people sometimes people are arguing that the nation is an artificial construct. And it has to do with some of the work of academics who are sort of suggesting this, but they don't really, I think, ultimately mean it, because what they are suggesting is there still are building blocks and materials, right? That, you know, Sweden is in some sense a recent nation state, but in other ways it has a very long history. And you know, the creation of this kind of narrative and a sense of identity, you know, does actually, you know, reach back in time. And that's not possible really for the EU. That is indeed, you know, a much more fractured, you know, concept in itself. Now, I would argue, however, that if you are at a greater distance from Europe, things do change. I mean, I always think about that when I'm out traveling. Like if I'm traveling inside of the Nordic countries, you know, we are always confronted with what Freud would call the narcissism of minor differences. Norwegians actually quite seriously think that they are fundamentally different from Swedes. Swedes think they are really quite superior to the Danes and so forth and so on. Now, if you're outside of the Scandinavian countries, you know, find these people immediately recognize how similar they are, right? How much they actually have in common. But it's also true, you know, I remember in California sitting on a beach, you know, possibly having smoked a little too much marijuana, but still with my friends from, you know, different European countries, and they're confronted with the nuttiness of America. We all felt very European, right? So it's not like it isn't there, but I think institutionally speaking, it has not, you know, reached that point. Then we can say, hey, it's still recent, right? You know, we don't know for sure what it's going to be like in 50 years. But I think it comes down to institution building. I think certain programs, let's say the Erasmus program in the university world and so forth, student exchanges, Ryanair, you know, there are certain institutions that do operate and function in this way. But so far, you know, it's not an entirely happy project.
Okay.
No, I would just like to follow up with your question. Lars, don't you think that one explanation why we don't have this strong European identity is because there aren't any social welfare systems? Because people have to somehow be intervened with each other.
That's right.
In order to feel solidarity and in order to feel that you're a part of a bigger we.
I think that's a very, very important point. And I think that one thing that sometimes critics of nationalism misunderstand is that, you know, if we are concerned from a sort of vaguely left perspective, right, about things like fairness and equality, redistribution and so forth, the nation state is still ultimately the only game in town, right? That is where you have that sort of politics of solidarity. And I think a lot of populists, as we now call them, right? We used to call them in Sweden, you know, people who had a democratic point of view from the people. But now it's this sort of, there's the good elite versus the bad people, right? And what is going on here, of course, is that this sort of cosmopolitan EU project is a pretty good deal for the elites, right? There's resources, there's money, there's job opportunities and whatnot, right? But when it comes to what you were talking about, actual distribution, provision of social rights, making these kinds of investments, it is at a great distance, right, from people in a way which the nation state, when it's at its best, is not. You know, it's closer to home. There's a linkage institutionally there which gives it credibility and provides a sort of sense of belonging that's linked precisely to what you're talking about. So I think that's a very important point.
Yeah. As it happens, somebody said we don't feel European. I think most of us do feel European. But feeling European has got nothing to do with the EU. It's not the EU that makes us feel European. I think it's the fact that we easily travel. We feel that there is something that's common. I think most people that I know actually feel quite European without necessarily that being their dominant identity. Being European is just an element of what they are. I think the one question that we haven't talked about, which is was raised over there, is what initiated this whole process? What led to the unraveling of both the institutions and the cultural dimensions of belonging? It's got very much to do with what Hannah Arendt called the crisis of authority and the crisis of tradition. Because the nation state, like any other institutions, are built upon certain assumptions, certain values, most of which, for better or worse, have become fairly weak. They've become quite eroded. They no longer motivate people, you know, whether it's the family, traditional family, whether it's the traditional community, whether it's traditional religion, all those things have become extremely marginal to people's life. And I think in many respects, a lot of what we're discussing can be understood as both the loss of tradition and the difficulty that we have in terms of reconciling community with individual rights, with individual sensibilities. And therefore, I think it's possible to look at the problem of belonging as a bad problem, because we all want to belong. But I think it can also be seen as a good problem, because in many respects, we can create new forms of community on the basis of a much greater recognition of who we are as individuals. I don't think we can go back to the pre-individual days. I think that's no longer an option. What we can do is go forward and reconcile our individual aspirations and the demand for individual rights, the demand for individual choice, with something that transcends the individual. I think that's the key question of our time. How do we find something that transcends us as individuals or segmented groups? And it seems to me that we should also be looking at the opportunities that the present predicament poses for us, rather than just simply, see it from an entirely negative light.
Well, I just want to say here, though, that this is very interesting what you're describing. I'm sorry. That, of course, my main argument, which you wouldn't necessarily be familiar with, right, regarding Sweden, is precisely that what makes Sweden interesting as a social contract is this alliance between state and individual. Right? I refer to this as statist individualism. That is to say that it is a social contract, and indeed, a social system that is predicated on an embrace of individualism, right, which is an advantage, right, given the condition that we're in, as you say. It's a society that's geared its citizens, embrace their citizens in their quest for individual freedom, right, and self-realization, indeed in global market society even, right. So the politics of solidarity here, right, is connected, right, to the idea of individual freedom. So Sweden at its very best, right, this is my own personal national narrative, right, is both a project of individual freedom and social solidarity, and in that sense, right, I think it is probably one reason that Sweden and the other Nordic countries are societies that rate high both in our measures on individualism and social trust, right, at the same time, which of course is a huge advantage on both individual and social levels right now. And for me, at least, I find that this type of discussion about who we are is very crucial. As you were saying before, these are stories that are geared towards the future, right? That are not sort of just merely fantasies about some kind of distant past in a kind of a language of nostalgia. But I really think this point that you bring up here, right, about individual freedom and its connection community is absolutely central. This is the old Kantian paradox. Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, he said, it is the fate of humans to be caught, right, in the field of tension, right, between, on the one hand, this deep urge for individual sovereignty, and on the other, the absolute necessity to live in society. That is a universal problem that needs to be resolved in practice in every society. And I think there the Nordic countries have been, have come up with a particular, right, resolution of that particular tension that can be built on.
I think one explanation behind why we are discussing these national identities and we feel a certain uncertainty about this is that it's difficult to define ethnicity nowadays, because I mean most of the national identities, they are based on idea of ethnicity, and in our global world, where especially when people are migrating and the population is more diverse, it's difficult to define ethnicity. I mean, for example, Swedishness. I think it was easier 20, 30 years ago to have an imagined community where you didn't have to say that, I mean, to define what's a Swede. Today it's more difficult, and I think that's why we are debating and discussing this.
Right, and I also think it's interesting when we're confronted with difference, we as in, the Swedish nation, and there is this strong, what you call state individualism, a very kind of pretty unique social organization globally. Like outsiders coming into that, how easy is it for them to adapt to that and to understand that that is the very particular social contract that exists in Sweden, and how good or bad are we at letting those outsiders in? But perhaps if there is a willingness to embrace that, is that not a way of overcoming what you said, the necessity of like blood ties? Because if you just accept this social contract, then there is a way for you to become just as Swedish as anyone else.
But there's a problem, and the problem is that in the old days, America could bring everybody in, and there could be what they used to call a melting pot fairly effortlessly. And same thing in Canada to some extent. These kind of things worked. But now one of the problems that we have in Europe, and I think Sweden is going to have that problem sooner or later, I think it already is having that problem, is that the Swedes themselves don't know exactly what they are about, who they really are, then people coming in are coming into a world which is very confused. And one of the things, I've got a PhD student who's been going around interviewing young Muslim kids who are drawn towards the jihadist kind of outlook. And one of the things that they all say, and it's quite understandable, is that we've come to Britain, but what is that? What is it that we've come to? Who are you? And it's almost like they've got a sense of, sort of superiority, that at least we know where we come from, we know what we're about. Whereas you, on the other hand, are saying one thing on Monday, something else on Tuesday, something else on Wednesday. And it becomes quite understandable that people come in, and it's not really clear what is it that they're coming into, because the host nations, for a variety of reasons that we discussed, are sending out very confused messages and are themselves very insecure about their own place in the world. And I think as long as that's the case, then as people come in, there is going to be a lot of difficulties. But it's not the problem is not immigration. The problem is that the host nations themselves, sort of have lost the capacity to kind of provide a focus for people's loyalties and emotional attachments.
I think one problem is that there is something that people are coming to, but we are not. We don't articulate it. What that we are, or what that common thing is, because often when you, as an immigrant, confront with Swedishness, one can often hear that there is no such thing as Swedishness. There is no such thing as common certain values, a way of behaving, and so on. But then again, you can feel it, that there is something that you can't get access to.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, again, historically, it's interesting the way in which we sort of abandoned that here. In 1920, when the first social democratic minister in charge of what used to be the sort of the Department of Religion, of really the state church here in Sweden, he made an interesting change. And back in those days, we used to read catechesen, Bible studies, right? Because Sweden was a Lutheran country, and you learned fundamental values by studying the Bible. That's how you became Swedish. And he said, to hell with that. Now we're now social democracy, and we're doing something else. So we created this book called Medborgarkunskap, Civics, right? You would say in English. And this was a bestseller in Sweden from certain 1920 into the 1950s. And this book then contained both, right, the stories about Sweden, the history, the free peasants, all the struggles we carried out to stay free as a nation and free people and all of this stuff, beautiful stories. But it also gave you also sort of information about the nitty-gritty details of how democracy actually works, how you vote and, how the system operates, so forth. That was abandoned, around 1955 in Sweden, right? When it was thought that this was seen like a little old-fashioned. Why do we need this anymore? And then today we have this kind of new discussion suddenly where people started talking about, well, maybe we need some manual like this, right, for people to kind of get an idea both who we are and how our systems actually work. In the Swedish case, it had to do with this turn towards modernism, right? It was kind of an idea, starting really already in the 1930s, but really accelerating after the war, but that we are no longer concerned about our own history, because we are a modernist project. We are the future, and so therefore the past is sort of not as interesting. That I think, in some sense we can think of now as a little bit of a mistake, right? It would have been good to kind of keep some of those stories and information available more. And it's hard to go back. I think you're right about that. It's difficult to go back. But I find myself, who is out often here lecturing from the book that you mentioned, I find always people are very interested in it, right? Because, in fact, people like to hear, these kinds of coherent stories about, what the country is all about. And I think we, as academics or public intellectuals, if you want to be more pretentious about it, have a responsibility, right, to engage in that degree of discussion, and not only act, right, as a sort of people who are critically uncovering and debunking stories about who we are, which is a little bit what has happened, after the war.
So maybe the academics are having an identity crisis too.
Maybe.
Good on him.
Any thoughts? Right. Good. Lots of hands. There's one next to you.
Hi, I'm interested in something you were just talking about in a way, the tools to sort of create this cohesion. What other ones might there be? On a sort of superficial level, there's nation branding and all kinds of attempts to communicate a clear national unity, but that's on one level and kind of a sign of the times. But what else? I mean, is it a textbook or is it a military draft? What can you think of?
Okay. I had a man here in the front. Oh. And then one waving by the pole there. Yeah.
In the United States, there is the Pledge of Allegiance. It's some sort of trohetseden, a short passage, not a whole book, like in Sweden before the 1954 or when it was. Do you think that it needs to be an elaborate or long story, or I'm a member of the
140 characters.
Yes, yes. And you mentioned here that Muslims who arrive here, they feel a strong unity, and they perhaps get confused, and perhaps they do not think that we have anything to come with, so they feel it's better to stick together and not cooperate, perhaps. I don't know. But I'm a member of the Amoristerna, and we have a creed. It's or what do we need? How long would this be? Or
yeah, great. There was a man there with... Yeah.
Yes, it's a very interesting discussion. I'm very happy to hear and listen to all these opinions. And I think, on the contrary, that there is no problem with this crisis that we're talking about of nationalist or national identity. I think there's a fantastic world we're living in with the World Wide Web, and we have all these possibilities to choose what kind of group we want to belong to, and we can have contacts with you were talking about the cosmopolitans. Maybe not everyone can go to Switzerland or France, but you can definitely Google Earth around the world and be a cosmopolitan, even if you're sitting in the northern part of Sweden. I think... but there are many contradictories if you see the new government of Sweden, who in the first statement they recognize the Palestine state, which is actually a nationalistic, how to say, positive thing for this crisis, maybe. But on the other hand, it can increase the human right. That was probably the ideas to diminish the tension in that area. And I think that, on the other hand, I was listening to the Nordic Council that had a whole meeting recently that we were discussing, and they were discussing about a Nordic state. So that's a new old ideas who are coming back, and maybe that's due to the pressure of different values actually in the global. You have the Russians and the West who are still meeting around, but that's just a reflection.
Right, you opened some cans of worms, but we had another Rob.
Hello. Well, I think earlier on we discovered that we do all have one thing in common, despite our different nationalities, is that we all think Dutch people are really funny. So we've got something to work on there. I want to play devil's advocate a little bit and ask, is it as much of a problem as is being made out? We worry about community and solidarity, but maybe those things only come into existence when we need them. So I was thinking about the London bombings in 2005. Now, I don't know if any of you have travelled to London before or been on public transport in London. It's not that people don't talk to each other. It's that making eye contact is practically a criminal offence. So suddenly, the system gets shut down. Nobody knows what's going on. Everybody has to walk everywhere, and suddenly people are talking to each other. It's incredible. It's like helping each other out, getting home, and suddenly there's a basis of need for there to be some kind of community, for what it's worth, some sense of solidarity and helping each other out. And since modern society generally works quite well, do we need that solidarity? The market generally provides, and what it doesn't provide, the state provides. So do we need it? Or actually, perhaps we could look at it the other way. Have the market and the state, in their different ways, destroyed that solidarity?
Okay. Any more questions? No? We have time for a final round of questions later. And if there's anyone among you who wishes to ask in Swedish, that is also fine. I can translate. Who would like to start? Frank.
Yeah, I just want to deal with the question of what works. In Britain, our previous Prime Minister, Brown, tried to introduce a book that Lars mentioned. And basically, it was meant to be two books. The first book was going to be a book of British songs, sort of for everybody. And then the second book was going to be about Britishness. Well, the committee spent 3.5 years trying to put together a book of British songs. They couldn't agree. And in the end, they said, well, we can't agree, therefore, we'll put down every song. We can have a book of 400 songs, which is about everything. So basically, what they were saying is that they couldn't come to an agreement about something like that. And what we've done is we've introduced all these rituals. We have citizenship ceremonies. We have all these, not quite the American pledging of loyalties at a more low level. But the trouble is that these are all, it's like the EU institutions. These are all artificial steps that were taken that are not organic to people's experiences. Whereas the book that Lars was talking about, I'm sure, meant something to people. And therefore, the very fact that it was seen as old-fashioned indicated that it was linked to something that was Swedish in the real sense of the word. Whereas today, whenever we try to do something like that, we end up almost like becoming jokes in a sense, because they don't really touch people in the right kind of a way. And if you want to know what I mean, you should go to the EU Museum of European History, which begins in 1945. There's no history before 1945 because it's too embarrassing. And too much divisions. And you create this mythical nation that's being created around these value statements that don't mean very much. So I don't think that there's anything we can do in terms of artificial doing that. But I think there are other things that we can do. For example, I think somebody mentioned education. I think education is becoming no longer a common experience. I mean, one of the things that progressive people used to agree on is that every child should have a common curriculum, that our education, they might go in a different direction, but we need to have a common schooling system. That kind of is the bottom line. Many European places now, there's no longer a common education system. We need certain common experiences that are not artificial, but are linked to people's life, that we kind of build on. And I think that if we sort of have a discussion and a debate about this, then I think all societies can really come up with those kinds of answers. And to answer your question, we do need solidarity. There's no doubt about that. So that's not an option, because without solidarity, our individuality suffers too. I mean, if we're isolated, estranged, privatized individuals, become much weaker and much feebler. And the very fact that the answer you come up with is the internet is a symptom of the problem. I mean, these days, every time somebody wants to say, "Oh, there's some good things going on," it's the internet. With lots of people doing what I call, sort of cyber loafing on it, sort of kind of making their way. But that just simply reinforces the problem online that we already have offline.
Okay, sorry.
I think we need a new narrative, a new story. But I think one problem is that in our global, fast-changing world, it's difficult to actually write it down, because as soon as you've written it, it's old. That's why it's becoming a joke. So I think it's difficult to write it down, but what we can do is to encourage many voices. I think that's a way, because the story of Sweden or Swedishness, it has to be built on something else than the idea of ethnicity. I mean, how you link history with past, with present, and future. It has been based on an idea that you have some sort of blood tie or connection, and we have to change that. And that's a difficult question, because you can't say you have to do this and this and this and that.
Mm. But has it? I don't know. I sort of want to challenge this idea. I know I'm the objective chair, but is it really down to blood ties and ethnicity?
In Sweden, yes,
or
still.
I disagree, right?
Yes.
I think that has become more fashionable in recent years to make that argument. And I think, the reason that sort of narrative has come up, right, which is also linked to all sorts of fantasies that Sweden in the 1930s was like totally dominated by race biology, and they were sort of fellow travelers with Nazi Germans, stuff like that. I mean, there's no empirical grounding for that. Yes, there was some race biology, but that was a very marginal phenomenon. National Socialism as an ideology, I mean, it was very marginal. In fact, Hitler was extraordinarily disappointed with all of the Nordic countries for not getting excited enough about his ideas. After all, they were the heroes in his story. We had, a constitutional patriotism during this period, which was not linked, in fact, right, to an ethnic notion, of Swedishness. And that's a very strong tradition to build on, And I find it a little sometimes, I'm not talking about you specifically here, but more generally, I guess sometimes annoyed, because there's sort of a lack of kind of historical depth, right, when that is being suggested. But I agree with you very much that whatever this sort of story we create, has to have a we that is not linked to ethnicity. No question about that. There's no need for that, as in my view. We have a lot of very good building blocks here. I do think, though, your point is well taken. I completely agree with you that the idea of sort of today sit down, especially if it's a committee, to write a book of this sort, would be it's a doomed project. And unfortunately, I think this is what we see. It's the same thing as the argument you made before about all of these sort of value statements that you see in everything from sports clubs to businesses to organizations. In Sweden, we have värdegrund, which is this kind of a platform of values that becomes just a cliche, right? They all repeat the same mantra eventually. I would just want to get back to the institutional part. I mean, there was a question asked about, about draft, about the Pledge of Allegiance, and so forth. I think that has to be, we have to be good anthropologists, right? It's both about practices and discourses. Both of these things are important. You can't do only one of the two. The U.S. is interesting in the sense that if you think about the literature that comes out about America, right? Every year there's a ton of books about the founding fathers and about American identity and so forth and so on. You have, it would be unthinkable to have like at the end of an election campaign, not American flags with all parties. I found it a little depressing here when I was watching the Swedish returns, and I noticed that the only party that actually had Swedish flags in their studio were the Sweden Democrats. I mean, I find that a little puzzling, a little sad, actually. You find there that you have a linkage between these rituals, right? That you see in lots of different places, and the discourses. Someone was brought up the question of the draft. It's an interesting situation right now we have in Sweden, because the new Minister of Defense is actually, interested in this idea, right, of having a discussion about a kind of a modern version of the draft. And this is reinforced, of course, by the realization that the world is not this peaceful place that the Swedes thought, that it was. We got a little problem here towards the east, and we may actually need an army, and we may actually think not only in terms of rights, but also in duties, so the old social democratic rhetoric about kräv din rätt, gör din plikt. We may actually need to return to that, and then the question of who we are really becomes important, you see. And then you have this linkage between the stories we tell and the things we do, right? I'm not sure we can ever find our way back to this, but I would welcome a serious discussion about it, right? And it's not a discussion that should be driven by Sweden Democrats. It should be a discussion about us, that comes from good people everywhere.
You wanted to add something?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that, in one sense, we have this Pledge of Allegiance. It's actually the Swedish Act of Governance, which is regeringsformen, which says that all public authority is driven from the public, and the government is the one ruling and responsible for riksdag, which is the parliament. Yes. That's sort of that's a sort of a baseline.
Yeah. How many of you have heard about or know it? Okay. Some of us. Great. Do we have any more comments from the floor? Yeah, one more here.
Well, I think you all touched on this, but I wanted to ask the question about nationalism being conceived as racist, because I think many people I speak to find it hard to distinguish nationalism from racism. Why do you think that is?
Yeah. Any more before? Yeah, here. And then one in. I can see an arm in the back, but I can't see. There's one in the front first. Oh, and there. God, it's so hard to see. I'm sorry. I hope I'm not missing any. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you're saying there is a crisis of nationalism, nations. Is there a risk that it will be reinforced? Maybe.
Could you speak into the mic?
I'm wondering if there's a risk that national will be kind of resurrected through like a battle against something, like a common enemy or something that will unite the nation in some way. Is there a risk for that, since there is a crisis in identity? Could someone kind of use it in that key?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. And we had a person in the back, and then if you could give the microphone to that lady sitting in the middle row here. And yeah, go ahead in the back.
So this rise of nationalism is often touted as a crisis of democracy, where the voters for Sweden Democrats are often said to be protesting the current system. And that might it not be that it's because there's a lack of questioning like fundamental values in the political discourse in Sweden, for example. Like there's no mainstream discussion about our democratic institutions, whether they're really democratic or if we need to have, you know, some kind of reform in these areas. And you know, both on the left and the right, it's really growing. You know, maybe because there is no such discussion.
Okay, thank you. And yeah.
Yes, it's a little bit, it's kind of same question. I'm just really questioning, is the loss of a clear national identity really an issue? And I'm also asking, like, what's the purpose of formulating a new common national narrative? What's the purpose? Is it to push back extremists, or like, is it really a problem? And what's the purpose of creating this new common national narrative? Yeah.
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 We like straightforward questions. Thank you. And there was one other hand in the back that was, or two more hands. Is it just the gentleman in the back, and then I have no idea where the mic is. Okay.
Yeah, I have a question regarding values, which you mentioned. It's if you remove the boundaries of all the countries and you would reform just temporarily, and would you say that there would be arbitrarily bound between different values between people then instead, and that's why we need nationalism?
Thank you. Yeah, in the back.
Just one question. Earlier you mentioned that recession was not the cause of anti-immigrant feeling, and then you mentioned America, the melting pot, and I wonder how far the American, optimism and situation of growth played into making people want to be part of this, and knowing very much what America stands for, apart from the Declaration of Independence and the general promise of freedom.
Okay, thank you. Right, and we now have a chance to come back and pick and choose from those questions. I thought there was something specific that you wanted to.
Yeah,
you were indicating.
Well, only that point about why nationalism. And I'm not saying that we should find a new nationalist ideology. I think that we have to find an answer to the question of what is it that binds us together. Right? I mean, that's a question that every society is confronted with. Is there something that we all sign up to that gives us a common purpose, gives us a sense of where we're going in the future? And I think that that's the challenge that we face with. You have to remember that nationalism comes in many shapes and many guises. There are racial forms of nationalism, but that's not the only one. I mean, French nationalism in the Revolution was universalistic. It had a very liberal, non-ethnic, sort of orientation, very different than German, Prussian particularism. So there's all kinds of nationalism that have existed. As it happens, I think today, the decline of nationalism is paralleled by the decline of internationalism. I mean, all the stuff of globalization has got nothing to do with internationalism in the old classical sense. All of these things, I think, in a sense, came together. One of the questions people have been talking about around is multiculturalism. Now, I take the view that multiculturalism could have been a good idea. But in fact, multiculturalism became an excuse to avoid answering the question, what is the culture that brings us together? And therefore, multiculturalism in all European societies is a very evasive way of not answering the question of who are we, what are we all about? And I think in that sense, multiculturalism has been on balance a negative and even a destructive force, because it allowed us to avoid dealing with some very fundamental issues. I think that we can bring in multi-ethnic groups from all over the world, but that's not the same thing as multiculturalism. I think at the end of the day, we do need some kind of sort of answers about what is it that we are about, what is it that binds us together, and that's something that will take. I haven't got the answers for that, and it doesn't have to have any resemblance to nationalism in the past, but it is something that we desperately need a discussion about.
Right, but actually, I have a question on that, because we also live in new times where there are waves of immigration, patterns of immigration that look very different to the past. So if multiculturalism in the way that you describe it constitutes a sort of threat or maybe a hindrance to a sense of cohesion or togetherness, is there no sense in which this blend of cultures or this difference coming in from outside is a threat to that? I mean, like, where does the responsibility lie among, the people immigrating or coming into?
Well, let me give you an example. I live in a small town near Canterbury, England. And because I'm East European originally, all the East European immigrants have often come to me to ask for advice, the Hungarians and the Poles and the Romanians, because they know who I am. And when you talk to them, one of the things they always say is that, Frank, it's very interesting. We come to England, and one of the reasons why we come to England is because we want to be English. I mean, contrary to everything else, they want to be British. And they say every time we kind of reach out, we're told, we respect your culture, you Poles and you Hungarians and everybody else. We really think, your difference is really quite important. And they become really kind of confused, because in their eyes, they've come to join a society. And instead of being allowed to join a society, they realize that there isn't really membership open to them, not because they're being denied membership, because nobody else has membership. And I think in that sense, multiculturalism does a tremendous disservice, because that's what people naturally aspire to. And okay, different immigrant groups have got different ways of relating to that, and some are more reserved, but I always notice, Pakistanis going to Canada and America are very different than Pakistanis in England, because in England, in America and Canada, they're right in the mainstream of society. In England, they're not, and I think that's partially to do with this multicultural, sort of political approach to these things.
I mean, I totally agree with you, Frank. I think that multiculturalism is a way of avoiding this idea of cohesion. But I think that we often mix, or we are rather confused about multiculturalism and diversity. I mean, we don't see that it's two different things. Multiculturalism is about having a community within a community, but not being a state, right? Where diversity is something else. I mean, we are all diverse and have different sorts of identities. But I would like to pick up the question about whether there are values, common values in Sweden. And I would say that, of course, there are Swedish values. I mean, our laws are based on values. But the thing is that what Swedish values are, they keep on constantly changing. Because every year, for example, in the parliament, they make many new laws, and they get rid of laws that doesn't feel relevant anymore. So in that sense, there are certain sets of values that are common in Sweden, but they keep changing, and that's why it's difficult to write them down in a book or in a manifesto or something.
Great, thank you, Lars.
Well, I think you're right in a way, but it's also true that, I mean, as an historian, right, I'm struck by, like many historians, I think, by two things. One is, right, of course, things change all the time. History is one damn thing after the next, right? But on the other hand, very little changes, right? You have sticky structures, you have a lot of continuity, right? So I think both are true, right? And if you look at all of the studies that we actually do have on values, right? The stuff that's been measured in World Value Survey, for example, what is really striking is the degree of stability, within the context of change, to be sure, right? But it's stable as well. So it's not quite, as difficult, I think, actually, ultimately, if we sort of stay focused, right, on that, while obviously being open to the change that does occur. I just wanted to sort of, my final comments, just go back to some of the questions, and a question about racism and nationalism, right, which was raised, and the questioning of nationalism. You already, Frank, you already dealt with some of that. And I just wanted to say, of course, I understand perfectly well why there are a lot of people who feel uncomfortable, right, with talk about the nation and nationalism. Because historically, of course, nationalism, as Frank said, has, manifested itself in forms that have been, racist. German National Socialism is just the most dramatic and lethal example of that. So in that way, it's not particularly surprising why people would find talk of nationalism or the nation to be unsettling, even distasteful. But we also have to remember, right, that the history of nationalism is a much more complex affair, that it actually coincides with the development of democracy. I mean, the words from the French Revolution about liberty, equality, fraternity had, found expression in terms of fraternity, but also individual freedom and equality, precisely, right, in the idea of the nation state. You cannot separate these things out historically in a very meaningful way. And what it sometimes worries me a little bit, particularly of the critics from the left, who are, I would say, by and large, very well-meaning critics who embrace sort of ideas about human rights rather than a narrow sort of rights within the nation, is that they have to remember the historical mistake made by the left in the late 19th century and early 20th century with respect to the nation. There were so many of them in the internationalist left who thought, like Marx, right, that the nation was destined for the dustbin of history, right? That's why we have the international. The red flag was supposed to replace the national flags. But that did not work out. And it was the only democracies that survived in the 1930s were those, right? The Nordic countries, France, although it's defeated, Britain, United States, were countries that I would argue had a solid, what I would think of a democratic or even left nationalism, right, that operated with power, right, to ensure the survival, right, of democracy. And I would, leave you with just a simple thesis, that is to say, enduring, left politics can only survive over time and have real breakthrough if it is attached to a national narrative. A nationalism, a left-wing politics without a nationalism has no future, really, to succeed. And I think that this is a historical lesson, right, that people on left in particular need to remember and learn.
That was going to be the final word, but you wanted to have...
No,
sure?
it's okay. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much to our speakers. If we could give them a final round of applause.